Imagine you are the leader of a major global power, right? And you wake up and your daily briefing looks like a total nightmare.
Oh, yeah. The kind of briefing that just ruins your whole term.
Exactly. Like your military needs this massive, rapid buildup because you have three nuclear-armed neighbors acting openly hostile. But at the same exact time, your population is plummeting so fast that major sectors of your economy are just failing.
And, your currency is in free fall on top of that.
Right. The currency is crashing, and the interest on your national debt is suddenly threatening to swallow your entire federal budget. And you don't get to solve these problems one by one. You have to manage this massive four-way collision of macroeconomics, demographics, and geopolitics all at the exact same time.
Honestly, it sounds less like a real policy challenge and more like, I don't know, the stress test simulation designed to literally break a government.
Yeah, completely.
Because the sheer compounding pressure of all those variables happening simultaneously, that is unprecedented in modern economic history. It really is. And welcome to this deep dive, where we are looking at a highly detailed memorandum from May 2026. This was published in the Global Review by Dr. Novin and Associates.
It's a fantastic piece of research.
Super detailed. And our mission today is to understand how this exact nightmare scenario is currently unfolding in Japan. We're going to map out the mechanics of this crisis, and crucially, we're going to explain why a currency intervention happening all the way in Tokyo could directly determine, the interest rate you pay on your next mortgage.
Yeah, and that is really the core of this analysis. We are moving far beyond local Japanese politics here.
Right.
We're looking at these deep structural vulnerabilities in the world's fourth largest economy. And those vulnerabilities are transmitting shockwaves directly into global fixed income markets.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Japan in 2026 is basically operating in its most demanding policy environment since the end of the Second World War. And at the helm of all this is Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi.
Right, Japan's first female prime minister. Exactly. And she has really established herself as the most security-oriented leader the country has seen in generations. She just secured this massive political supermajority.
Which is huge.
Right, and she is using every single ounce of that political capital to accelerate defense spending to 2% of GDP. And doing it way ahead of the original timeline.
And, we should emphasize that 2% target represents a seismic shift for Japan.
Oh, yeah.
Because for decades, they maintained this strict, unofficial cap of just 1%. So doubling that footprint requires an incredible amount of capital. But her administration views it as just a non-negotiable survival imperative.
Because of the geography.
Exactly. The geographic reality is that Japan is essentially surrounded by a geopolitical ring of fire.
Well, let's break down those threat vectors, starting with China. Because Takaichi didn't just, express concern about Taiwan. She formally declared that a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan would constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan.
And that specific phrase is incredibly important legally.
Right, because of the 2016 legislation.
Yeah, under Japan's 2016 peace and security legislation, designating an event as a survival-threatening situation. That is the actual legal trigger that allows the government to deploy the Japan Self-Defense Forces alongside the U.S. military.
It totally removes the ambiguity.
It does. And Beijing understood the legal weight of that phrasing immediately. The sources note they retaliated by escalating their presence, deploying Coast Guard vessels right to the disputed Senkaku Islands.
Wow.
Furthermore, during some recent naval exercises, the Chinese military used J-20 stealth fighters and attack drones to closely shadow a Japanese destroyer navigating the Taiwan Strait. It was a very clear, kinetic demonstration of area denial.
So the western flank is just incredibly tense right now. But the security map gets even more complicated when you look at the Korean Peninsula.
Oh, absolutely.
Because North Korea hasn't just sustained its ballistic missile testing, which, by the way, keeps Japanese early warning systems on near constant alert. But Pyongyang is actively deepening a strategic and nuclear partnership with Russia. So we are now seeing combined military exercises involving North Korean, Russian, and Chinese forces.
And the consolidation of those three nuclear-armed neighbors into cooperative military drills, that forces Japan to fundamentally recalculate its entire deterrence strategy.
Right.
But the wild part is, the most immediate paralyzing threat to Japan's security right now isn't actually in the Pacific. It's over in the Middle East.
Right, because of the Strait of Hormuz. There's an effective blockade of the strait by Iranian forces. And, well, this is a byproduct of the broader regional conflict, but it hits Japan harder than almost anyone else.
Yeah, because they import everything.
Exactly. Japan imports nearly 100% of its crude oil, and the vast majority of that energy lifeline flows directly through Hormuz. If that strait closes, Japan's economy simply stops functioning.
Which creates a massive point of friction within the U.S.-Japan alliance. The sources detail how the United States, under President Trump, is heavily pressuring Tokyo. They want Japan to contribute naval assets to a coalition force aimed at reopening the strait.
Sort of a quid pro quo.
Basically, the U.S. expectation is that, hey, if Japan wants American protection in the Pacific, Japan needs to help secure its own oil supply in the Middle East.
But Takaichi cannot just order a destroyer to the Persian Gulf to engage in active combat. And this is where we run into the reality of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution.
Right, the pacifist clause.
Yeah, this is the clause written right after World War II, where Japan formally renounced war as a sovereign right,
Right.
and it banned the maintenance of military forces with war potential. Now, while that interpretation has stretched over the years to allow for self-defense, sending ships halfway across the world to actively break a blockade, I mean, that crosses a massive constitutional red line.
It makes direct combat roles legally prohibitive. And politically, it's just explosive. So to compensate for not sending ships to Hormuz, Japan is completely overhauling its domestic strike capabilities. The memo notes they are heavily investing in missiles with a 1,000-kilometer range.
Which is a total paradigm shift. I mean, they are acquiring, for the very first time in the post-war era, weapons that are actually capable of striking the mainland of China or North Korea.
Yeah, it transforms their posture from purely defensive, where they rely on the U.S. for offensive projection, to suddenly possessing independent counterstrike capabilities.
I just look at the sheer scale of what they are trying to do, and it feels like, trying to install an incredibly complex, expensive new security system while your house is literally already on fire.
That's a great way to put it.
And your neighbors are actively throwing fireworks at your roof, and the supply truck carrying your fire extinguishers is permanently blocked at the end of the street.
The logistical strain is just immense. But here's the thing, acquiring the hardware, like actually buying the 1,000-kilometer missiles, that's actually the easy part.
Right.
The structural impossibility comes when you try to operationalize that equipment. You need a massive, youthful military force to staff the control rooms, maintain the logistics lines, and operate the bases.
And that brings us to the core structural rot of this entire situation. Japan's demographic emergency. The numbers here are just staggering. Japan is currently losing approximately 1 million people every single year.
Million people a year. That is the equivalent of a major metropolitan area simply evaporating from the census annually. The fertility rate is sitting at a dismal 1.2 births per woman, which is far below the 2.07 replacement level.
And the population isn't just shrinking, right? It's rapidly aging.
Yeah.
Over 30% of the population is now over the age of 65. And even more extreme, more than 1 in 10 citizens is over the age of 80.
Yeah.
We always talk about demographic decline as this slow-moving problem for future generations to figure out, but the memorandum makes it incredibly clear this is a 2026 economic lethal event.
Because the labor market has effectively broken. In 2024, bankruptcies attributed entirely to labor shortages surged by 32%.
Wow.
Small and medium enterprises are literally shutting their doors, not because they aren't profitable, but because they physically cannot find the human beings to staff the assembly lines or run the storefronts.
And for Prime Minister Takaichi, this translates directly to a Japan self-defense force recruiting crisis.
Exactly.
The youth cohort is simply too small to meet the manpower demands of her historic military expansion. So the government's proposed fix for this is something they're calling Society 5.0.
Right, the big tech pivot.
Yeah. The idea is to go all in on artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, and automation. They basically want to systematically replace missing human workers in labor-intensive sectors like manufacturing, retail, and hospitality with intelligent machines.
What's fascinating here is the severe temporal mismatch between the problem and the solution. Because the demographic depletion is actively destroying businesses today.
Yeah.
But the productivity dividend that's promised by AI and robotics, that requires a medium to long-term transition.
Wait, hold on. I mean, integrating AI into a lean, modern tech company is hard enough. You're telling me Japan expects to integrate robotics into legacy mom-and-pop manufacturers, rural hospitality businesses, and traditional logistics networks fast enough to stop bankruptcies this year?
Yeah.
That just sounds like a total pipe dream.
Well, you are identifying the exact friction point the authors highlight.
Hmm.
You cannot simply drop an enterprise AI software package into a 70-year-old manufacturing plant and expect it to seamlessly replace retiring floor managers.
Yeah.
The capital expenditure to automate is massive, and the transition phase often disrupts productivity way before it actually enhances it.
So what does this all mean? If you can't build an army with robots today, and you don't have the youth to keep the legacy economy running, I mean, the government really has no choice but to just throw massive amounts of money at the problem, right? They have to subsidize these failing businesses and spend their way through the transition.
That is the administration's exact playbook. But doing so slams them directly into a brutal macroeconomic wall. Japan holds the highest government debt-to-GDP ratio in the advanced world.
It's massive.
Yeah, the projections have it reaching 232% by the end of 2026.
232%. That means their national debt is well over double the size of their entire economic output.
Right.
And despite this, Takaichi is pushing forward with massive spending. Not just the defense buildup, but she is actively proposing the suspension of the food sales tax for 2 years. She's trying to offer some relief to everyday consumers who are just getting completely crushed by inflation.
And we have to connect that inflation back to the geopolitics we talked about. Because the Strait of Hormuz is blocked and Japan imports all its oil, energy costs have gone totally parabolic.
Yeah.
This acts as a highly regressive tax on the Japanese public. I mean, electricity rates were hiked 4 times in a single year. Real household income is dropping, and corporate profit margins are compressing.
Which places the Bank of Japan in an absolute nightmare scenario. Because when inflation runs hot, a central bank's primary tool is to raise interest rates to cool the economy down. So in April 2026, the Bank of Japan finally moved. They raised rates to 0.75%. Now, I know it sounds like a tiny number, but that is the highest short-term borrowing cost in Japan since 1995. And it was a fractured, deeply divided 6-3 vote.
And that internal division makes perfect sense when you look at the mechanics of sovereign debt. When you have a debt load equal to 232% of your GDP, your single biggest vulnerability is the interest you pay to service that debt.
Right.
Every single time the Bank of Japan raises interest rates, the cost for the government to simply make the interest payments on that mountain of debt skyrockets.
Yeah.
It just cannibalizes the rest of the federal budget.
But they had no choice. If they didn't raise rates, the currency would completely collapse. And honestly, we saw the Japanese yen violently crashing anyway, hitting roughly 160 to the US dollar by late April.
Yeah, and the mechanics driving that currency crash,
Yeah.
they really come down to the interest rate differential between Tokyo and Washington. While the Bank of Japan agonizingly pushed rates up to 0.75%, the U.S. Federal Reserve's interest rate is sitting way up between 3.50 and 3.75%.
Let's walk through what that actually means for the market. If you manage a massive institutional fund, your entire job is to find yield.
Right.
Why would you ever keep billions of dollars parked in yen earning less than 1% when you can instantly move that capital into US dollars and earn nearly 4%? The math just dictates that capital must flow out of Japan and into the United States.
Exactly. Investors borrow or sell yen to buy dollars. That massive systemic selling pressure just floods the market with yen, driving its value into the ground.
Yeah.
And a weak currency is catastrophic for Japan because they price their imported oil in U.S. dollars. So a crashing yen means that already expensive Middle Eastern oil becomes exponentially more expensive, which drives domestic inflation even higher. It is a textbook vicious cycle.
So to break that cycle, Japan's Ministry of Finance deployed the nuclear option. Over just a few weeks in April and May, they spent an estimated $72 billion intervening in the currency markets.
Huge numbers.
Massive. And to explain how that works mechanistically, the government takes its own reserve stockpile of US dollars, goes into the open market, and violently buys up their own currency. They create this massive wave of artificial demand to physically drag the value of the yen back up.
It is a brute force tactic, and it is incredibly expensive, which naturally triggers a diplomatic intervention from the United States. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent travels to Tokyo in May 2026.
And the background of Scott Bessent is crucial here. He is not just some career politician who reads briefing binders.
No, not at all.
He is a former macro hedge fund manager. In his private sector career, he literally shorted the yen.
Yep.
And for those unfamiliar, shorting a currency basically means you borrow it, sell it, wait for the value to drop, buy it back at a cheaper price, and pocket the difference. So he understands the structural vulnerabilities of the yen on a molecular level.
He really does. He fundamentally understands that artificial intervention cannot fix a structural interest rate gap.
Right.
The memorandum describes his message to Tokyo as this blunt ultimatum.
Right.
He basically said, stop burning through your foreign reserves to artificially prop up the yen. Instead, close the interest rate differential organically. He demanded the Bank of Japan raise interest rates to a full 1.0%.
Which, as the authors note completely impartially, puts Takaichi in a terrible political bind. I mean, she campaigned on keeping borrowing costs low for everyday households and businesses. She wanted a slow, managed transition. But the merciless reality of global capital flows, amplified by the demands of the U.S. Treasury, is forcing her hand.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to address the underlying motivation. Why does the U.S. Treasury Secretary care so deeply about how Japan manages its currency intervention that he flies all the way to Tokyo to issue an ultimatum?
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is the moment where policies formulated in Tokyo land directly on your kitchen table. The United States cares because Japan's currency intervention is funded by selling U.S. debt.
Exactly.
Think of Japan's foreign exchange reserves as this massive emergency piggy bank. But that piggy bank isn't filled with cash, it is filled with U.S. Treasury bonds.
Japan is the single largest foreign sovereign holder of U.S. debt in the world. They hold approximately $1.24 trillion in U.S. government bonds. So when the Ministry of Finance needs billions of U.S. dollars to buy yen and stop the currency from crashing, they acquire those dollars by liquidating their U.S. Treasury holdings.
So let's follow the chain reaction in the bond market. When Japan suddenly dumps tens of billions of dollars of U.S. Treasuries onto the open market, the supply of those bonds surges.
Right.
In any market, when supply vastly outweighs demand, the price drops. So the price of U.S. Treasury bonds falls. But the crucial mechanic of the bond market is that prices and yields move in opposite directions. When the price of the bond goes down, the yield of the interest rate goes up.
And the memorandum explicitly tracks this transmission effect. The authors highlight a specific event in January 2026 where a surge in Japanese bond yields immediately translated across the Pacific.
It was instant.
Within hours, U.S. Treasury yields spiked in tandem. The fixed income markets are completely integrated.
So if you are listening to this right now, let's connect the dots. Because Iran blockades the Strait of Hormuz, Japan's energy costs explode. Because China is threatening Taiwan, Japan has to buy billion-dollar missile systems. To fund this, while their tax base shrinks from demographic collapse, Japan prints money, which crashes the yen.
Yep.
To save the yen, Japan sells off U.S. treasuries. When they sell those treasuries, U.S. bond yields spike. And because almost all consumer debt in America, the mortgage rate you get on a house, the APR on your auto loan, your credit card interest, all of that is benchmarked against U.S. Treasury yields.
Exactly.
So the cost of your life gets more expensive. You are paying for the friction in Tokyo.
It is the ultimate demonstration of Japan's role as the pricing reference for global fixed income. The G7 finance ministers are acutely aware of this contagion risk. The authors of the memo urgently recommend that the G7 establish explicit frameworks to manage the volatility, because the transmission mechanism between Japanese interventions and U.S. borrowing costs is immediate and severe.
It is an almost incomprehensible balancing act. Prime Minister Takaichi has to execute a historic military buildup against immediate nuclear threats. She has to manage a society that is aging so rapidly it's breaking the labor market.
Yeah.
She has to defend a collapsing currency, all while servicing the largest debt pile in the developed world, knowing that the very tool used to fight inflation raising interest rates could trigger a sovereign debt crisis.
And she must navigate all of this while maintaining the political mandate of a population that is seeing its real wealth erode daily. The authors conclude that it is the most complex, demanding policy matrix Japan has faced in 80 years.
I can't even imagine.
But they also make a profound observation about the global significance of this crisis. The G7 partners aren't just treating Japan as an ally in distress, they are observing it as a living laboratory.
Because the missing million people a year isn't a uniquely Japanese phenomenon, it's just happening to them first.
Precisely. Japan is simply at the leading edge of a global demographic cliff. The exact same structural population collapse is mathematically baked in for Germany, Italy, and South Korea over the next decade.
Wow.
How Japan attempts to survive their aggressive push for female labor force participation, their experiments with selective immigration, and their desperate pivot to Society 5.0 and AI automation that will write the survival blueprint for the rest of the developed economies?
This raises an important question.
It does. It forces us to look at the limits of technological salvation.
Right. Think about this as you go about your day. Japan possesses immense national wealth. They have incredible technological infrastructure. They have a society renowned for its cohesion and discipline. They're throwing every single resource they have at this demographic collapse, basically betting their entire economic future on the idea that AI and robotics can replace missing humans.
It's a huge gamble.
If a nation as advanced as Japan struggles to innovate its way out of this, well, what happens when the rest of the developed world hits that exact same wall? Can algorithms and automation actually replace the raw economic and societal vitality of human beings? Or is Japan currently proving that there is a hard, inescapable limit to the AI revolution?
The global economy will be watching Tokyo very closely for the answer.
For sure. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll catch you next time.